Early morning was surprisingly calm. A light mist lay over the village, sliding between wooden houses and sparse trees that lined the dirt road. The air was cool, clean, filled with the scent of damp grass and morning freshness. Birds were just beginning their song, breaking the fragile silence that reigned on the village outskirts. At this time of day, few people appeared on the road. Occasionally an old local car would drive by, heading to town or the fields. Everything felt familiar, measured, as if time moved slower here. But into this peaceful picture, something strange suddenly entered. A lone horse stood on the road. It didn't move, didn't graze, wasn't searching for food. It just stood directly in the middle of the road, as if on purpose. Its figure in the morning light seemed almost ghostly, its silhouette blurred in the mist, outlined by a soft golden halo from the rising sun. At first glance, it looked like a trivial scene, an animal off track, lost, maybe escaped from someone's yard. But a closer look revealed something was off. The horse wasn't wild, remnants of a bridle were visible on its neck, but it didn't seem frightened. Rather, it seemed focused. It stood as though guarding the road or waiting for something. The first passing cars started to notice it. Some stopped, others tried to drive around. But with every minute, it became clear, the horse wasn't going anywhere. It stood firm, as if rooted to the ground, confident in its place. Some drivers tried to approach, waved their arms, clapped on the hood, made loud noises to scare it off, but it didn't budge. Its eyes remained fixed on a single point, beyond the trees, off the road, where a gully began. In those eyes, there was no fear, but a deep anxiety. A tension so palpable that even people watching from afar could feel it. It was as if the horse wasn't simply standing there, but trying to warn of something. Some began to feel a tightness in their chest, as though they had become part of something far greater than just a random encounter with an animal on the road. An hour passed. Then another. People from a nearby village began talking about the horse standing on the road. Some went to see, others to take pictures, a few just out of curiosity. But the more people came, the stronger the general feeling of unease grew. There were no obvious signs of danger, and yet the tension in the air became undeniable. The horse barely moved. Sometimes it shifted its weight from one leg to another, breathed heavily, but always returned to its original position. It seemed that it had to be here, and no outside effort could make it leave. Its coat was dusty, its legs bore traces of mud, as if it had traveled long through damp terrain. At one point, someone noticed something strange on its front leg. A piece of cloth, like a torn piece of shirt or scarf, was tied around its joint. It looked too deliberate to be a coincidence. This detail only heightened the growing concern. Why was the horse's leg wrapped in fabric? Who had done this? Was it connected to its behavior? No one had an answer. The wind picked up, scattering the morning mist and revealing more and more of the surrounding landscape. But the horse stayed in place. Behind it, past the road, the gully thick with underbrush led into an old forest. Few people ventured that way, and certainly no one lived there. Yet that was exactly where the animal's gaze was fixed, watchful, unwavering. One local man said the horse seemed to be guarding a passage. Another woman added that it looked like it was calling someone, but silently, in its own way. Everyone could feel it, as rising tension before a storm. And in that anxious stillness, the story began. A story no one expected. One that started in calm but from the first minutes felt like a harbinger of something important and terrifying at once. As the sun rose higher and the morning mist fully dissipated, a small crowd had already gathered around the horse. People approached cautiously, some filming with their phones, others whispering to each other, but nearly everyone felt that this was not just a random encounter with an animal. The horse didn't react to the noise, didn't try to flee or act aggressively. It simply stood there like a sentinel at the border between two worlds, the human and the wild, the ordinary and the unsettling. One of the men, a local farmer, tried to get a closer look, peering into the horse's eyes. He didn't see fear, only persistence. In those eyes was a silent plea, hinting at a story no one yet understood. The horse gently lowered its head, as if inviting someone to follow, took a few steps toward the forest, then stopped and looked back, as if to see whether anyone would follow. Several people exchanged glances, hesitant to move. The forest beyond the ravine was old and mostly untouched, overgrown with vegetation and deep shadows. Few ventured there, not out of superstition, but because there had never been a reason. But now, with the horse clearly pointing the way, the tension in the air thickened. It felt as though something lost or forgotten waited in the hush of those trees, and that only the horse knew where it was. One of the younger men, visiting from a nearby village, suggested they follow it. He guessed it might be leading them to a lost foal or an injured animal left behind in the woods. But even he didn't sound convinced. Deep down, he sensed the reason was more profound. In the end, 3 people volunteered to follow: the young man, an older hunter who had known the area since childhood, and a woman visiting the village from an animal shelter. They took flashlights, phones, and a rope, just in case the horse truly led them to something in need. The rest stayed behind, watching silently, unable to look away from the strange, slow-moving scene unfolding before them. The horse moved forward. It walked slowly, cautiously stepping across the soft forest floor, as if retracing a familiar path. The trees arched overhead, forming a canopy that dimmed the daylight even during midday. The air felt different here, dense, filled with the scent of damp earth, roots, and moss. Step by step, the horse led them down an invisible trail, never faltering, never hesitating. Those following it began to feel the unease growing stronger inside them, as though something long buried stirred beneath their feet. They passed fallen trees, tracks of wild animals, but nothing that explained the horse's strange behavior. Occasionally it would pause, lift its head to listen, then continue onward. The woman noticed that the horse's breathing had grown more tense, as if it sensed they were getting close. At one point, they reached a small stream hidden among stones and tangled roots. Here, the horse stopped again, looked to the right, and gave that same motion, a nod of the head, a glance. The people turned and noticed something shifting in the bushes. At first, it looked like wind moving the leaves. But then, they spotted a shape in the grass, small, pale, almost blending in with the forest. It was a child, lying pressed against the ground, barely moving. He wore a damp jacket, and his face held a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The horse approached him and lowered its head, as if to make sure he was still breathing. One of the people rushed forward, followed quickly by the others. They lifted the boy, checked his breathing. He was alive, though dehydrated, weakened, and had clearly spent hours alone in the forest. No one could explain how he had ended up there. Later, it would be revealed that he'd gone missing in the morning, wandered off, and gotten lost. His parents had already contacted authorities, but no one knew where to start searching. That it was the horse who led them to him seemed nothing short of miraculous. It belonged to no one in the village. No one recognized it. Where it came from and why it led them into the forest raised more questions than answers. But in that moment, they simply gave thanks that the boy was alive. And the horse, it stood nearby for a few more moments. Then, as the rescuers carried the child back, it calmly turned and disappeared into the forest shadows, as if its mission had been fulfilled. And that was when the real unease began, because this felt like more than just a story about an animal. The forest seemed to freeze, immersed in anticipation. The air became dense and cool despite the daytime heat that filtered through the treetops. The people who had rescued the boy didn't hurry to leave. Their thoughts were consumed by the strange chain of events that defied logical explanation. No one knew where the horse had come from, why it had appeared at that moment, or why it had led them there. Most importantly, how could it have known that a child lay in the thicket in desperate need of help? It wasn't a domesticated horse. There were no signs of harnesses on its coat, and its hooves were slightly worn, like those of an animal that had wandered a long way across rough terrain. And yet, its movements were purposeful, as if it understood exactly what it was doing. People began to speak of animal intuition, how some creatures can sense danger, hear what humans cannot, see what's hidden from the naked eye. But even the most skeptical among them couldn't shake the internal tremor. This was something more than coincidence. It felt like a sign. When the child was brought to the village and handed over to the doctors, attention shifted back to the horse. But it was nowhere to be seen. Those who remained in the forest tried to follow its trail, but the hooves had left almost no prints on the soft carpet of moss and fallen leaves. The very path it had taken seemed to vanish. 3 men decided to retrace their steps, starting from the point where the horse had first stopped on the road. They walked in silence, examining every detail. One of them noticed that the entire route passed by areas where someone could have stumbled, gotten lost, or fallen into danger, as if the horse had deliberately chosen a path that avoided all hazards. It was hard to grasp or accept, but more and more signs confirmed that the animal had led them with clear intention. Near the stream where the boy had been found, they paused. One man crouched and began examining the grass flattened by the child's body. That's when he noticed another detail, a faint impression in the earth a few meters away, as if a hoof had scratched the ground and left a shallow dent. It was from there that the trail began. At that moment, the man realized that the horse might have been standing beside the boy even before the people arrived. Perhaps it had guarded him. Perhaps it had kept him warm, standing nearby as a living barrier against the cold forest air. The thought seemed strange, but deep down, it felt absolutely real. People began to recall other stories of animals showing empathy and an instinct to help. But never before had they witnessed an unfamiliar creature coming directly to people for help, and then guiding them to a life in peril. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the forest filled with long shadows, one of the men returned to the spot near the stream. He sat on a fallen log and lingered in the silence, as if hoping the horse would return. It didn't. But the air still felt heavy with its presence. The forest no longer seemed frightening. It had changed, as though something within it had been revealed. The next morning, several locals set out to find the animal, but to no avail. Neither nearby farms nor stables nor the surrounding forests had seen such a horse. It had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. People began to speak of it as a messenger, a guardian. For many, it became a symbol of something pure, sincere, and deeply right, something sorely lacking in everyday life. The days that followed brought a sense of calm, though it was not without a quiet sense of awe. In the village, the story of the horse quickly became more than just a memory. It turned into a legend. People spoke about it in hushed tones around dinner tables, under the warm flicker of lanterns, or while gathering firewood near the edge of the forest. What had once been seen as just another patch of wilderness now seemed sacred, imbued with meaning. The trail the horse had taken was walked repeatedly, not for the sake of searching, but more like a ritual, an act of respect. Some brought small offerings, a ribbon tied around a tree, a flower laid at the base of the trunk, a candle flickering in a mason jar. Children who had once feared the woods now peered into them with curiosity and reverence, imagining the gentle creature stepping silently between the trees, eyes full of knowledge. The boy, now recovering, was still too young to explain everything clearly, but his parents noticed a change in him. He no longer feared the dark, no longer cried when left alone even briefly. There was a calmness in his eyes, a maturity as if he had seen something no one else had. He didn't speak often of what had happened, but whenever someone mentioned the horse, his face lit up, not in fear, but with a soft glow of recognition. It was as if a bond had been formed between him and the creature, something beyond explanation. In his sleep, he sometimes whispered to it, words no one could understand, and in those moments, even his restless dreams seemed peaceful. The adults, too, changed. The story touched something deep inside them, a part that had grown quiet over the years, buried under routines and daily concerns. They began to reflect on what they had ignored, the way nature speaks, the silent ways animals show their presence, and how easily people overlook the signs around them. The horse was not just an animal, it had become a mirror. It had shown them their own compassion, their ability to act selflessly, and the quiet strength that still lived within their community. Neighbors who had hardly spoken began to greet one another. Fences were repaired not just with wood, but with care. The woods were no longer a boundary, they became a place of connection, of healing. There were those who tried to rationalize it. They looked for scientific explanations, tried to trace migration patterns, checked wildlife records. But no data could explain why the horse had come exactly at that time, stood exactly on that road, and led them unerringly through dense forest to a child who had no way to call for help. In the end, even the most skeptical conceded that something had happened, something that couldn't be measured, only felt. Weeks passed. Life settled, but the memory of the horse did not fade. It became part of the village's rhythm, its collective story. The road where it had stood was now walked differently, more slowly, more attentively. People looked out, not with fear, but with hope. Some said they still saw a shape in the mist, a shadow moving just beyond the trees. Others heard a quiet rustle at night, not alarming, but calming, as if something kind still watched over them. And in the hearts of many, especially the boy's parents, the horse remained, not as a ghost or fantasy, but as a symbol of faith. Not faith in the supernatural, necessarily, but in life's capacity to surprise, to connect, to awaken something dormant and true. A reminder that sometimes help arrives not in the way one expects, but in the form one most needs. And when it does, it changes everything, not only the outcome, but the soul itself.